Welcome to episode 9 of Ethnocynology. In the summer of 2022, I participated in the LaPrele Mammoth Site excavations, and I posted this video that went viral on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. Now, a bone needle is cool. It's tiny, it's cool, but it's not, it's not a mammoth bone, a huge mammoth bone, right? It's not a Roman mosaic, it's not a Clovis point. It's not the body of like Jim Bridger himself with a bunch of arrows in his back. It's not that interesting, but to archaeologists and to people like myself, that bone needle is actually one of the most interesting things you can find at a Clovis site like that. And one of the comments on that video always stuck with me until today while I'm making this video. And I had that person who commented that submit their comment as a video real quick. I'll play that.
I just find it amazing how something so small was so integral to everyday life and survival.
And she's right. That is also my friend Camille. I've met her through Instagram, honestly, because she comments really engaging things on my posts, always asks good questions and starts conversation that's, beneficial to my following and the study of archaeology. She's very interested in archaeology and has said that to me many times. So that comment really stuck out to me also because it's just true. Like something so, and I'm going to digress here, but a recent paper came out from that site with the researchers I was working with about the bone needle, and they used a new type of science called Zooarchaeology by Mass Spectrometry, which is a very fancy way of saying like they put the bone into a machine and the machine kind of tells them what animal it could be. It's a lot more intricate than that. We will get into that, some hard science there, but also some soft science of archaeology and why this bone needle is important. So what I'm going to do with this video is take into consideration Camille's comment, someone that's, not an archaeologist that just engages with my stuff and understands the bigger picture here and like commented something so interesting. With that in mind, I interviewed some of the researchers of this paper that I worked with at that site, asked them their opinions on that too, and why is a bone needle so important. But also I asked them about the paper. Why did you do this? What surprised you about the results? What surprised you about, what discussion did this bring up? But also something I'm going to do is talk about how you read an academic paper. And then I might as well just do it with this. It's a short and easy paper. And if you want to follow along, the link to the paper is in the description. And if you only follow me for the dog stuff or the memes or, just different kind of archaeology stuff, I promise you stick with this video because it will be fascinating to you. And it really gets into the nitty-gritty of how science works and then how passionate we all are about this. But mainly, why is a bone needle so important? And we will get to that. The first thing you do when you read an academic paper is read the abstract. I'm not going to read the abstract right now because that will spoil the rest of the video, but you can go ahead and read the abstract if you want, or you can wait, or you probably won't even read it. The next part of the paper would be, and when you look up, here's the other thing, when you look up papers online, you usually only see the abstract. The abstract is like published for most people to see, so you can get a gist of what the paper is talking about. And it usually lays out the introduction, talks vaguely about the methods, the results, and the conclusion and the discussion conclusion. So you can get a feel for what the paper's about. Is this relevant to my research? Do I want to read this? Or is it just, not worth looking at? And that's what an abstract does. But it also, that's the first thing you should read, when you glaze an academic paper. So when your teacher calls on you in class, what was the paper about? What were your thoughts? You could at least read the abstract and be like, I think the garment aspect is really cool. That's in the abstract. But we're going to start with the introduction. Now, the introduction talks about, the background of the site, but also human subsistence, how humans used tailored garments in the past, where they used tailored garments, why they used tailored garments, and things like that. Now, the main thing here that I want to set up is this site, Pleistocene, Wyoming, Ice Age, Wyoming, and I just want to stress to you how cold Wyoming is. And if you're like, why is a bone needle important? Well, here's why. Well, obviously, we'll talk about this throughout the video. Wyoming is freezing. It gets to like 0 pretty frequently in the winter, and it gets into the negatives. That's now. That's in the Holocene. That's in today, while there's, climate change or warming going on, right? We're in a warming period. Still freezing. Very cold. Like, I can breathe and my breath will like freeze to my mustache. There's other times where, like, once it gets past 0, you really shouldn't be outside because you can die. And when it gets past, to negative 17, I think was the most I ever experienced. It might have been more than that. It's just funny at that point because you're like, it is so cold out. Like, you'll just die. Okay. Dude, that's like, that's 2 feet, 3 feet. Yeah. It's just it's insane. But imagine that 10, 11,000 years ago, in the middle of the plains where it's just windy, so windy. I drove a Jeep in Wyoming for years, and it's so boxy on the highway I'd get shifted around. Imagine living in like a domed or a conical structure out on the plains made of mammoth and bison hide with all that wind, and it was freezing. It'd be warm because you're in there. Of course, the way to sew those hides, to stitch them together to make a shelter with, and a way to use your clothes is to use a bone needle. So the introduction of this paper talks about how humans use these tools to keep a microclimate on their body and whatnot. And I'm going to have Dr. Spencer Pelton lay out the landscape of the site, what it was like, what people lived like back then. And then I'm going to have him go into what his dissertation research was, which was understanding human thermoregulation. And also he did some ethnographic research in Mongolia, where it's even colder than Wyoming, living with nomadic herders, trying to understand how they operate and use space, but also how they keep warm and how they make their clothing and things like that in the past. So I'm going to have Spencer talk about that, and this is the introduction of the paper.
I'm Spencer Pelton, the Wyoming State Archaeologist, member of the Office of the Wyoming State Archaeologist, which is part of State Parks and Cultural Resources here in Wyoming.
So I asked Spencer, can you give us some background on the LaPrele Mammoth Site?
Yep. LaPrele is, as of right now, the oldest archaeological site in Wyoming, occupied by Early Paleoindians. We have diagnostic artifacts from both the Clovis and Folsom archaeological cultures. Initially, it was a Clovis mammoth kill, a juvenile mammoth associated with a small assemblage of artifacts. So when we started excavating the site in 2014, we didn't know that it was a mammoth kill. We knew it was after 2014. And then since then, the site's just kind of gradually expanded and expanded and expanded. And so now the site is very much an early Paleoindian campsite with a mammoth kill in it. And around that mammoth kill, there's a bunch of really dense concentrations of artifacts that we argue represent the floors of houses that were occupied almost 13,000 years ago. Probably where people camped for, say, like 2 weeks to a month or something like that.
And I have Spencer elaborate here because I want you to just get a better picture of what the site would have looked like. And I ask him, is this like the quintessential Paleolithic site? And like, what would the daily life be like then?
That's what it looks like to me. Every one of these little clusters has kind of a different character to it. Some of them are just scatters of flakes around probably a hearth. Another one of them has a really dense scatter of red ochre on the floor of the house. It looks like maybe people were processing hide or doing something with red ochre. A couple of the other areas are just really dense concentrations of flaking debris and end scrapers and stone tools, very much like heavily occupied houses where people were conducting a lot of activities. But yeah, it would have been kind of a bustling Paleolithic campsite with basically every activity you'd expect to find in those campsites occurring: flint knapping and hide processing and building weaponry and repairing clothes for certain.
One thing to stress here of the introduction: of the various technologies and behaviors enacted to cope with cold temperatures, complex tailored garments are amongst the most important. Spencer did his dissertation on thermoregulation, like how humans maintain heat and how they've done that throughout history from, earliest hominids to now. And I asked him, what is thermoregulation? Like, just talk about it.
My dissertation was on thermoregulation, and it was really because I felt like it was a huge missing piece of this human behavioral ecological puzzle that archaeologists talk about a lot. Archaeologists talked a lot about food, the decisions people make to obtain food, which animals do they kill, how do they process those animals. And that's really been kind of the focal point of human behavioral ecology studies for a long time. But what I wanted to study in my dissertation was not just how you get calories in your body, but how you keep them in your body once they're there. Really what that comes down to is thermoregulation. We lose a lot of calories just through shivering and trying to thermoregulate our bodies. in the absence of clothing, and clothing is really our way of mitigating against that. So I saw it as a big kind of missing piece of the puzzle of human behavioral ecology past. So I looked at that question in a couple different ways. One was through the Folsom archaeological record, the Early Paleoindian archaeological record of the Plains and Rocky Mountains, looking at that record to determine if these tools that we think should be associated with thermoregulation are found in greater frequencies in cold climates than in warm climates across the entire range of the Folsom territory, if you want to call it that.
Spencer also did some work in Mongolia, understanding how reindeer herders there use space in the winter and the spring. He also did it with our professor, Todd Surville. And what Spencer did there, too, was part of his dissertation was understanding, wanting to know why. Here, I asked Spencer, why'd you go to Mongolia? And he explains.
Also did a little bit of ethnographic work in Mongolia just to observe how people make and repair clothing in a modern context in a mobile pastoralists. And it really hadn't changed that much. I mean, people are still using inscrapers, and they're still using perforators and needles and animal hides and all the same things that people were using 13,000, 40,000 years ago to make clothing. So I came away from those two projects with some pretty well-defined ideas of what thermoregulation should look like in the archaeological record. Two of those things were needles. You have to have needles to sew complex garments. There's really no other way around it. The other thing is the presence of fur-bearing animals, or what I called in my dissertation warm-skinned species, because it's not just fur, right? In some Arctic regions, people also use the skins of birds to make really warm weather garments, like eider ducks, where you can skin, you don't just pluck the feathers out and like stuff them in a pillow, right? You skin the bird and actually sew that skin into things like parka hoods and around the sleeves of parkas. So one expectation of my research was that we should find the remains of these sorts of animals in any Paleolithic context where people are making these fitted, tailored parka sort of garments in their cultures.
And then I asked Spencer, what's the significance of bone needles? Like, why write a paper on this?
I think a really simple answer is that they're extraordinarily rare globally.
Jake, you have it in place.
Yeah.
Even in the old world, we have 30,000 years of Paleolithic archaeology in the old world spanning 3 continents, basically. You can count on your fingers and toes how many sites have produced these bone needles. They're extremely rare, both because they're very fragile, but also because the recovery techniques that archaeologists typically use aren't fine-grained enough to recover these things on a consistent basis. You really have to be screening all your sediments through 16th-inch window mesh, basically, to find these things, unless you're super lucky or you're digging really slow and happen to find one in place. So there's that. It's just exciting to find rare stuff. Also, in addition to that, I think from a behavioral standpoint, there's no second guessing what a bone needle was for, really. It was for sewing. And we know that not all cultures sewed. And so it gives you a really direct line of evidence for a very specific behavior in the archaeological record that you really don't get with many other artifact types. Yeah. Maybe projectile points, but even then, people argue projectile points. Oh, were they actually used to kill things, or were they knives? Or an inscraper. Well, were they actually used to scrape things, or were they making wooden bowls or something? There's always a little ambiguity to like stone tool types. There's not with bone needles. And so finding that is just a great material correlate for a very specific behavior. And I think specific enough that we can say that they weren't used just to make any garment. They were used to make these very complex, tailored garments with fringe and very intricate seams sewn into them. Not like your typical kind of like frock or like the sorts of loose-fitting garments that you find among ethnographic cultures on the plains in the historic record.
Yeah. And then I asked Spencer, what's the oldest bone needle?
It's about 35,000 to 40,000 years old.
So about the time Homo sapiens were...
Bone needles are uniquely modern human.
And would you say that's a solid reason we were able to colonize Europe?
I think it's a big part of the reason. I think it's a big part of the reason why modern humans were able to, for instance, inhabit ecological niches that Neanderthals were not. Because if you're bound to a thermoregulatory environment like a cave during the winter months, there's really no way you can expand your range way out onto like the plains of Siberia, because you wouldn't have anywhere to retreat to, right, when things got tough. Right. And so modern humans, if they're equipped with this technology, with bone needles and as a proxy for these complex garments, they were certainly able to occupy distinct ecological niches in Eurasia and at a greater duration of the foraging season than their archaic ancestors.
And I brought up the thing to Spencer. I said, hey, my friend commented on the video when I posted that bone needle. Like, it's so interesting how something so small is so integral to life back in the day. And I have Spencer elaborate on that too.
I guess to start off with, you have to make these garments if you want to survive the Ice Age conditions of Wyoming. There's really no way around it. If people were not making these garments, they wouldn't have been living here. We don't have the physiological capacity to deal with temperatures like that. One alternative would be to basically hibernate during the winter, hole up in a cave, remain inert under blankets, basically starving until the spring comes around. But obviously modern humans weren't doing that. Neanderthals might have done that. They might have gone through periods of sort of pseudo-hibernation, or at least torpor during the winter when they experienced a lot of dietary stress. Modern humans did not. It's very obvious in my view, that modern humans were out foraging, hunting, doing the things that hunter-gatherers do basically all year round in the most extreme weather conditions that you can imagine. So in that regard, it's an extremely important tool, because there's nothing else that you could use to make these sorts of garments other than a bone needle. There's other sorts of perforators, right? There's like stone perforators and there's awls. But if you want to get a really tightly spaced water and wind resistant seam, you have to have a needle that passes all the way through that seam so that you can thread that really fine piece of sinew all the way through it and keep doing that. Whereas with an awl, you're producing a hole that big. A needle, you're producing a hole that's, no more than 2 millimeters big. So yeah, I mean, it's a very small kind of mundane aspect of a toolkit, but it's extremely important, as important as any other tool in the Paleolithic toolkit of people in Wyoming at that time.
This is something I had no idea, so I had Spencer elaborate on. Like, did Neanderthals hibernate? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I can. I haven't kept up with this literature as much, but there's this classic pattern in Neanderthal bone growth where it looks like there's regular periods of dietary stress throughout the adolescent period of Neanderthal development. And when you find those in modern populations, it means that people were starving on an annual basis, and basically their growth was inhibited because of that. And in the studies that I understand that have been done, a lot of juvenile Neanderthals have evidence of annual starvation. Since then, there's been some studies of Neanderthal, the structure of Neanderthal cancellous bone that seems to indicate, actually I don't think it's Neanderthals, it's ancestor bone, like 900,000-year-old hominin species, archaic hominin species from Spain. It suggests that they have some characteristics of basically hibernating animals, where some of these archaic hominin species, I don't think we could think about them as hibernators in the sense of like a groundhog, but they were certainly experiencing annual periods of torpor, where their metabolic rate probably dropped. They probably were on the verge of starvation the entire time. So in my mind, that was how archaic hominins coped with Ice Age conditions of Eurasia. They didn't produce these complex garments. They probably had some form of garments, like loose drape garments. But instead of being out foraging on the landscape during the winter, wearing these things to guard themselves against these cold temperatures, they probably just holed up in caves and huddled with their kin, tried to keep as warm as they could, tried to keep from starving. And then once the spring came around, they could kind of reemerge and start foraging again.
Now, Spencer's a very intelligent dude and very good at explaining what he does, but just in case you're a little confused or that went on too long for you, here's the gist. Humans have to make fine-tailored garments to make that microclimate stick to their body. You have to have something that traps that heat in. The same way when you're surviving out in the wilderness or camping, let's say, you have to have an elevated surface. You can't just sleep directly on the ground. You need a sleeping pad, then you need a sleeping bag, or you need to build a platform to sleep on. Like, you have to keep something in between your skin and the direct climate, which is, the cold outside. You have to make tailored garments to keep yourself alive. And to make those tailored garments, you have to hunt or trap other animals to use their bone to make needles with. Some places you can make needles out of plant fibers. In Ice Age Wyoming, shit out of luck. You gotta use bone. So to wrap up the introduction section there, what the paper is trying to do is establish that people did use these garments. These needles were probably used for sewing garments, because what other purpose would they have other than that? And what the paper is going to do now is use two different methods of understanding what those bones were made of to understand what kind of animals they were used from. Were they bison and mammoth, or was it something else? So this paper goes into that. One thing that this paper doesn't go into, because it doesn't necessarily need to, is how bone needles are made. I just texted my caveman guy, Donny Dust, a few minutes ago, and I was like, hey, do you have any videos on how you make bone needles? And he, of course, sent me like a bunch, and then we were texting a bunch back. It's really cool having a literal caveman on speed dial. So I'm going to put some of that here, and this is a video of Donny making a bone needle and how that process would have worked to get yourself into the mind frame of how these people used to live every day. But of course, Donny's sitting in his garage doing this. Imagine it sub-zero with the wind blasting you, and you're hungry.
Can you make a bone needle? Yeah. Bones, rock. Let's use this guy. I'm gonna put a hole in it right back here, and then I'm gonna grind it to shape. Use a couple flakes. We are looking good. Last most important thing is called your thread groove. There's a little groove leading from the hole as if the thread was coming out this way, just to give yourself a little less resistance when you're sewing. Just take a stone flake, carve it in. See a little groove right there? All right, let's sew something. All right, that's how I make a bone needle and sew something with it. Thanks for watching.
I'm editing right now, and I totally forgot. I just didn't add this part into the main video. But that was the quick way to make a bone needle. Like expedient, just smash the rock, or smash the bone with a rock and, make a quick bone needle and shape it in. There's another way where you take a burin, which is a type of tool, and you score the bone like into that shape. And then I'll just let Donny take it from here. But this is the second way to make one.
That's maybe after 5-6 minutes. See that needle starting to take shape, and actually when I hold it up to light I can start to see through it just a little bit. There we go, starting to come all the way through. There we go. Nice. So with these burns I was able to extract this solid piece of a bone from the middle of this deer leg. Now why this is a smarter choice than smashing it is if I'm hitting this with a rock, and I've done this several times to make needles, I could have some little micro cracks inside the needle, which could be a problem long term when I'm into sewing. Yes, this needle is going to need a little bit of refinement. But the great thing is when I'm using that burin, I already got that majority of that grinding and sanding kind of done. The burin's edges really just wore most of it down, and it almost comes out in a fully functioning bone needle.
That tool he's talking about is called a burin, and we always think of stone tools as like, spearheads and knives and things, but there's also tons of things like awls, which poke holes. There's scrapers, which scrape hides, and then there's burins like this, which also help score bone, just like he's doing. And you can see some of these were found at the site.
So yes, a burin is a very simple tool. Requires a little bit of flake removal, but you don't have to pull it from a core. You can use any sort of discoidal flake and produce those lateral flakes that come off that tip, and ultimately, your tips will really start to take shape. All three of these burins, I just started to really refine their points down, and before you know it, this looks like the standard archaeological find that you could come across for those cultures that use burns. Now, it did take me about 20 minutes to, extract this needle from this leg bone of a deer. But imagine if there's 2 or 3 working on it, maybe 5-6 minutes each, and before you know it, the needle's out. This is a great way to shape and carve antler. This is the same way that you would carve a harpoon. You got one long ridge and carving those teeth. If you ever wondered how it was done, they would kind of score that overall design and then use a burn to really get in there and, shape those teeth for a harpoon.
Anyway, long story short of what he's showing you there is to make ancient tools took a lot of skill and craftsmanship, and you had to know how to do this, and it's freezing and it's cold, especially in the Ice Age. So just to get you into the mindset of the people that lived at LaPrele, or at least lived there at the time when they were hunting this mammoth and trapping these animals, this is what they were doing. So if you can imagine that wind, that snow, that freezing temperature, sitting in a big yurt like the one I'm going to show here, or it's a conical structure, dome structure, that's what they're doing at this site. So when we're out there excavating, they're not just sitting cooking meat over a fire and eating it or flint knapping. They're doing stuff like this, and they're sewing clothes. Anyway, let's move on to methods and materials. Next up in a paper is the methods and materials. Methods and materials lays out literally your methods and materials, but what exactly you're going to do if you're setting up an experiment like this one did using this, scientific process to understand what the bone composition. How they did it, they used CT scans to look at the inside of the bone, and then they used Zooarchaeology by Mass Spectrometry, which is a very complex new science that I'm going to have PhD student McKenna Latinsky talk about, because she's the one who did this on this paper and can explain it way better than I can. But essentially, the introduction of the paper said, bone needles exist, here's why they existed, people need those microclimates on their body. We thought that they're usually made from mammoth and bison, which is at the site, but maybe they're made from something different. So the methods and materials now is going to set up the methods and the materials in which they used to conduct this experiment to understand what these bones were made of.
My name is McKenna Latinsky, and I'm a second-year PhD student here at the University of Wyoming.
I also asked McKenna, what's the point of this paper?
This paper focuses on the bone needles from the LaPrele Mammoth Site, and specifically identifying what animals these tools are created out of.
Now, McKenna is a literal genius at this. It's like a new type of science, and she's one of the only people out there right now doing this day in and day out for her master's and her dissertation. So of course she's stoked on this, and I asked her, what was your role in this research? What were you doing?
So my role in this research was undertaking Zooarchaeology by Mass Spectrometry on the bone needles, which allows for us to identify the needles where osteological markers aren't present. So basically it involves extracting collagen from these bones, resulting in individual peptide signatures, which then we can analyze to compare and contrast to known animals, which allows for us to ID these animals.
How did zooms play into this paper?
This specific technique, zooms is the acronym, is really helpful when these assemblages are very fragmentary, meaning we have no way to identify what animals these bones come from. But it can also be helpful in the case of bone tools, because these are created in such a way where these parts of the bones that allow us to identify them aren't there.
Now, this is going to be a lot to digest for some people, but I have McKenna explain what's the process of it.
It involves various steps. First, we are going to grind the bone into powder so that it's easily demineralized. That's the first major step of zooms, is demineralization, which involves putting the bone powder in hydrochloric acid to essentially get at the organic component of bone. We want to dissolve the mineral components and allow the organic component to be analyzed. The next step in zooms would be removing the humic acids from the samples, because soils have these humic acids which can contaminate our sample and essentially lead to noise in the spectra. The next step in zooms would be gelatinization, where you're going to put your sample in heat or an incubator, and this is going to allow for the peptides to be set up for digestion later. Digestion is the step after gelatinization. Trypsin is an enzyme that's typically found in a pig's stomach, And what that is going to do is it's going to break the peptides down into different masses and different lengths so that they can be measured later on in the process. Once digestion has taken place, we can then purify the samples using a C18 zip tip. And once the purification has been completed, we can spot the samples onto what is known as a moldy plate. When we are spotting the moldy plate, you are going to take the sample and spot it in triplicates, depending on where the dots are on that metal plate. From this point on, we can then load the plate into the very specific mass spectrometer that is used in zooms. That mass spectrometer is known as a matrix-assisted laser desorption ionization time-of-flight mass spectrometer, or in other words, it's a MALDI-TOF MS. Once the plate has been loaded into the mass spectrometer, there are 4 primary steps involved in this machine. First, the laser is going to hit the sample. Second, it's going to make that crystallized matrix explode and turn it into a gas in which the ions are positively charged. Third, it's going to send the ions through a time-of-flight tube. And lastly, the ions are going to hit an ion detector. From this point, the spectra or results of all of these processes that happen in the machine is going to be visible on a computer. On the spectra, there are 2 different variables that we can measure. We can measure the heights of the peaks, or the elements that compose the different peptides. In addition to that, we can analyze the peaks on the x-axis, which are called mass-to-charge ratios. And it's really that second variable, those mass-to-charge ratios, where the peaks are located on the x-axis, that is the most important for zooms. Because what mass-to-charge ratios do is the lighter massed peptides are going to show up earlier on in the spectra, and the peptides with heavier masses are going to show up later in the spectra. And it's important to note that not all peptides are diagnostic, but those diagnostic peptides that allow us to distinguish between genus and species taxa are known as marker peptides.
So essentially what's happening is you take some of the collagen from those bones, so from the bone needles, you break that down using peptides, and then science shit, and then you take that, put it into a MALDI-TOF MS, which I don't remember the acronym, I'll put that right here. It's a big machine that measures essentially like peaks and values in that collagen, and then you can take those peaks and values and compare them with those that are also in the database of other dogs, mammoth, cat, rhino, and see what these things are. And of course, you can't tell the difference between dog and wolf because you can barely do that when you're looking at a skull of a dog or a wolf. But what this can do is definitely tell you this was a rabbit versus a bison, and that's what they're looking for. It's a very fancy way of doing that. Kind of like that SpongeBob episode where Plankton puts the Krabby Patty into that machine trying to understand what the exact recipe is. We'll put that clip here.
How do you like my analyzer? It tells the ingredients of whatever I put into it.
Seaweed. 50% sea, 50% weed.
Oh boy.
Plankton. 1% evil, 99% hot gas.
Think of it like that. If you want, just the science is chill. Like people do this. You studied like years at this. It works, right? But it just, if you and I don't understand it, just use that as an example. You're just dropping something in the machine and it goes like, bang, hair. Eventually this will get down to the point where you can probably just, scan it with a barcode in 35 years from now. And it will just be like, blah, 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 Canis lupus, domestic dog or something, right? And I was a little confused reading the paper. Did they use the bone needle specifically on the zooms, or did they use bones like around the site? And I have her explain that.
So I was doing zooms on the needles themselves. So 2 of the needles we actually brought over to the University of Manchester. So my colleague Sarah Alon and I worked closely with Michael Buckley, who's actually the inventor of this technology. And he helped us to extract the collagen in a way where we don't destroy the morphology of the needles. And then the remaining needles we did run here at the University of Wyoming.
And then, of course, zooms is a destructive science in a way, and I asked McKenna to elaborate on that. Like, is zooms destructive? How did you do this?
Well, it kind of depends. Yeah. Okay. So those 2 needles that we brought over to the University of Manchester, we did successfully extract the collagen without destroying the actual shape of the needles. But when we tried to perform those same techniques here, we were unsuccessful. So then we went ahead and we did destroy small parts of the needle.
Sure. Gotta break eggs to make an omelet.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but I'm working on it for my dissertation, so it's been better.
We're going into the results. All you really need to know here is we successfully obtained spectra from 10 specimens, including 4 from Block B and 6 from Block D. Those are different excavation blocks that, may represent different houses. From these, we identified 3 families of mammalian fauna, including Canidae, Felidae, and Leporidae. So in other words, the methods and materials they used to analyze this bone gave them the result that these needles were not made from bison or mammoth like they had thought. They were actually made from foxes, cats, and hares, which is pretty interesting. And we'll get to why. For the dog people, possible canid species in the Pleistocene Wyoming include coyotes, Canis latrans, the gray wolf, Canis lupus, the gray fox, red fox, swift fox, the extinct Pleistocene direwolf, and possibly domesticated dogs. But again, very hard to tell wolves from dogs just looking at their actual bones and skeletons sometimes. So this thing's not going to be able to tell you that. Though, were there dogs at the site? No evidence yet. Possible species of felines in Pleistocene Wyoming include the Canada lynx, the bobcat, the mountain lion, the saber-toothed cat, American cheetah-like cat, scimitar cat, the American lion, and the Pleistocene North American jaguar. We have not compiled reference spectra for the scimitar cat, but we do know that the Block B needle fragments are derived from the subfamily Felinae. All that to say, the possible cats that these bone needles could have been made from were lynx, puma, or scimitar cat, which is like not a saber-toothed cat, but a big one. I can go into the different species of hares, but, no one really gives a shit. So just know that they were made from rabbits as well. I asked McKenna, were you surprised at the results? Like, did you expect it to be something different?
I was very surprised. It's just mind-blowing to me.
Can you kind of explain that? So, like, when I said, were you surprised that it was fox and cat? Like, how did you know?
We knew that these needles belonged to these specific animals, the fox, the cat, and the jackrabbit, because we already have these animals in our comparative database. So basically, we took known bones from animals like fox and rabbit, etc. We ran them through the same process, and then we developed multiple spectra reflecting peaks unique to these animals. And basically, we compare these unique peaks to an unknown spectra. We're comparing and contrasting, and then we're making these identifications based on the matches.
So in other words, the chemical signature of that bone more resembled the chemical signature of foxes that you'd already identified than it did, a mammoth.
Not necessarily the chemical signature, more the collagen and amino acids that are representing a specific mass, which is influencing the position of the peaks on that screen.
So just know that these bone needles are made from some kind of canid, some kind of felid, and some kind of hare. Now, more of this results section, I have this all, you can follow along here with the paper in the link in the description. I have it kind of marked out here. This really goes into detail of which excavation blocks and which, houses these needles and fragments were coming from. Dr. Kelly is here. This will be fun. Okay, so where exactly, what are we digging right here?
So what we are working on this year is we are about 20 meters south of where the mammoth remains were originally found and excavated in 1987. Okay. So what we're working on is another concentration of artifacts that we've found, in fact the densest concentration of artifacts that we've found on site to date, and we're working on kind of exposing the entire concentration and seeing how it looks in space. This site dates to about 12,900 years ago, and the people who lived here lived towards the end of the Ice Age. And what we think we have here is actually the camp that was occupied while people were processing, butchering, maybe preserving the mammoth remains. So we have everyone in the community present. And part of the reason that makes sense when you think about it is that during these time periods, people were already really mobile. So they were moving their houses all the time. And if you have access to a really big resource like a mammoth, it's much easier to move your house to that location and everybody who lives in it while you're processing, eating, or doing whatever you may want to do with those remains.
I don't really need to go into too much detail of that if you're not there at the site to see it. I don't have a big, picture of a reconstructed animated site, but something that you do need to know that is interesting, that we estimate Block D contains at least 2 bone needle preforms and 2 finished bone needles. We discovered fragments of 2 preforms made from hair from the same quad and level, 1 complete preform plotted in situ. In situ means in place.
Jake, you have it in place.
It's like right where it was found. You were excavating and you went, oh, bone needle, and you left it right where it was. As opposed to being found in the screen. And if you remember from episode 3, I talked about how the screening process works. And as Spencer said in his interview there, a lot of times bone needles don't get found because they don't have the proper screening methods to find them. They're tiny. They just end up with the rest of the dirt because they're so fine when you're looking for bigger things. So it's actually very important at these sites that you look for every single thing you can, which means screening it through finer and finer mesh until you find it. Or make sure that you haven't lost it. Another neat thing is here, finally, a needle midsection made of hair bone and a needle fragment made near the distal tip that did not yield a zoom spectrum were close enough in metric dimensions to be from the same artifact. Though they are located 1.8 meters apart, they probably are from the same artifact. Micro CT scans of bone needle fragments indicate production from cortical bone, although none of the bone needles from La Prele are complete due to the use-related and post-depositional fracturing. So they were breaking in use.
Now why this is a smarter choice than smashing it is if I'm hitting this with a rock, and I've done this several times to make needles, I could have some little micro cracks inside the needle, which could be a problem long term when I'm into sewing.
Here's something interesting. The CT scans. The metapodials and long bones of canids, felids, and leporids are among the only bones present in their respective skeletons that meet these criteria. Others being too curved, like ribs, or too thin, like scapulae, or too short, like phalanges, or inappropriately shaped, like vertebrae. Metapodial cortical bone thickness is especially similar to bone needle thickness. So using the bones in the hand of, digitigrade animals like cats and felids and stuff and rabbits. Whereas like unguligrade animals, which are horses, deer, cows, pigs, their metacarpal and metatarsals are huge. They're the big long things you would probably think is their shin bone. It's actually their hand bone. And this calls back to Donny. One would need only to score metapodials lengthwise with a flake or a graving tool, split them, and then pare down the width through carving or braiding to achieve the appropriate dimensions of bone needles. Put that up here with Donny. Thus, we think the most likely skeletal elements used to produce the La Prele bone needles were the metapodials of canids, felids, and specifically longer metatarsals of hares. We're going to move on to the discussion. Now, the discussion section is the section in which, you've already established the results, which is the raw, hard data of what you found. And then the discussion is the implications of those data. These bone needles are why are they finding these bone needles made this way? What are some future research projects you can do with this? And what does this mean for La Prele? And what does this mean for Wyoming history and world history? I'm going to weave Spencer's ideas back in here, too. And I asked Spencer, were you surprised by the results?
Well, the reason these results were so exciting to me was I had these 2 expectations of what we should find when people were making these garments, and it was bone needles and the bones of fur-bearing animals. And in our results, which show that these bone needles are made out of the bones of fur-bearing animals, we had kind of a convergence of those 2 lines of evidence in the same artifact. To be clear, I don't think, we made this clear in the paper, but it hasn't necessarily been made clear in the popular coverage of it. There are not bones of these animals in the site that we've identified, other than in the needles. So we don't have a fox skull or a cat vertebra. We do have a couple hair bones, but not many. So it wasn't really even on our radar as a type of animal to find in this site. I think the reason why they ended up in this site and why they were turned into bone needles is because when you skin these fur-bearing animals, you typically leave the foot bones in place within the fur, because once you get down to the foot bones of a canid or a felid, they're really tiny and intricate little spacings in between them, so you can't really get the hide off of them. So what you typically do is you skin them down to the legs and then you lop off the feet. So I think that's how those bones ended up in this site in the first place, is that people were trapping these animals, skinning them for their hides specifically, bringing those hides back to camp, and then using these really conveniently sized foot bones that are still clinging to these furs to make the bone needles out of. So they could just remove the foot bone, incise down the length of that bone, maybe in a couple places, remove a splinter from it, abrade it down, and then you got a bone needle. If you're working with a mammoth or a bison bone, bison has kind of been the conventionally assumed material these are made out of, because bison bone just dominates sites of this age. It would have taken a lot more work. I mean, these are really thick. The cortical bone on a bison, is half a centimeter thick or so. You got to basically shave that in half to get down to the size of a needle that you need. So that's what I think happened. Basically, people were trapping these fur-bearing animals so that they could sew those furs into clothing. By the nature of how you skin those animals, you ended up with these perfect little bone needle preforms in the feet. You take them out, incise them, turn them into a needle, and then you basically use the bones of that animal to sew its own skin into a parka.
And then I have Spencer elaborate more on the trapping aspect.
We know modern humans were able to trap stuff from a really early time, just because we end up with like rabbits and Paleolithic sites in Eurasia. Really the best way to trap a rabbit, or to kill a rabbit, is to trap it, unless you're doing it in like a big game drive situation. But trapping's never really been a big point of discussion in the early Paleoindian literature of North and South America. We have all these giant mammoth and bison kill sites, and they really dominate this record. And so a lot of the discussions about Paleoindian faunal use has been centered around those big charismatic fauna. And I think no doubt that comprised the vast majority of Paleoindian diets, was these big animals. But incorporating this whole other notion of trapping introduces kind of an entire other aspect to their hunting and like animal attainment system. It also suggests that people didn't just kill animals for food. They also killed some animals specifically for their hides or for their furs, and basically material to make clothing out of. I think that's one important point of the study, is that just because you find, a rabbit bone or a fox bone in a Paleoindian site doesn't necessarily mean those things were being targeted as part of like this subsistence practice. It could be targeted specifically for thermoregulation.
And after talking with Spencer, I was asking McKenna, who I interviewed after this, like what's your thoughts on the tool utility versus food aspect of these animals?
Whether or not people are selecting animals for opportunistic reasons is something that I'm trying to dive more into. I think there's a lot of different variables that go into why people select certain animals for tool production. One is they are readily available on the landscape, and people hunt them either for fur-bearing purposes, food purposes, etc., and they just use the remaining bones to craft these tools. Another reason might be the mechanics of the bone itself. So whether or not people can use these tools for longer periods of time due to bone structure influences, or how long it takes to produce the end result tool, depending on the element that they use, so the specific parts of the animal. And another reason might be pure symbolic or ritualistic purposes.
Gotcha. Okay, I didn't think about that. And something that's, a big movement in archaeology right now is incorporating indigenous perspectives into the research. Now, did someone living in Tennessee 200 years ago that was Cherokee have anything to do with someone who was a mammoth hunter 13,000 years ago in Wyoming? Probably not. Not that the person was Cherokee, I'm just giving an example. But they all descend from the same early groups of people that came to this continent, so it is worth asking their perspectives and understanding that, and McKenna elaborates here on that.
Yeah, so can I give a good example? Yeah. Okay, so a really good example that I'm finding in the ethnographic record, this particular group of people selected cougar skin to produce their clothing and their quivers for, and this was specifically for hunting magic, they claim. So people purposefully selected this animal not for thermoregulation capacity, but because these animals are magical to these hunters. I don't know if that's what's happening at LaPrele. I don't know if people selected these canids, felids, and jackrabbits because they thought they were magical per se, but it's something I'm thinking about in my broader research.
And then, you know, as McKenna pointed out with the magic aspect, I asked Spencer his opinion on this. Like, what are some other ideas and like theories you have on like the trapping versus the generalist and specialist kind of thing? Like, what would be your final point?
You can imagine a model where, yeah, you are a highly mobile Paleolithic hunter-gatherer, kind of chasing mammoths and bison around. But once you achieve that goal, you can kind of sit on top of that kill for a while as you're processing hides and processing meat, living off of that kill. And so what do you do during that time? Well, a lot of people are invested in these tasks, processing hide and meat and stuff, but then you have this whole other segment of society that's just hanging out, like children, teenagers. I kind of view this whole trapping component of the economy as probably being conducted by those sorts of members of the society, where maybe you're not physically capable enough to embark on like a really strenuous bison or mammoth hunt or something like that, but you are capable of running a trap line, maybe leaving camp, going on kind of a little circuit, setting up traps around it, and then your job every day or a couple times a day is to go around and check those traps. Yeah. And it really rounds out kind of the Paleoindian life way in a really interesting way in my mind.
Now that you did this paper, what are some applications you can use for this, or what are some other questions that you have, or what would you like to do with this research?
So now that we know that the needles recovered from La Prele belong to fox, cats, and jackrabbit, now we can put this site into the broader scope of why people are selecting certain animals to produce things like bone needles and bone awls. So as part of my broader dissertation research, I'm looking at animal identifications among a bigger sample of bone awls and needles from across 20 different sites in Wyoming in order to see how people are selecting these animals and why.
Anything else you'd like to add, McKenna?
I'm really happy to be part of this research. Yeah. I think it's pretty revolutionary. I think it's amazing that I was able to collaborate and do this in the first place, because not many people have the opportunity to run Zooms on bone needles from a 13,000-year-old mammoth killing campsite. So it's really cool.
Very rare.
Yeah.
So that was the discussion. The discussion essentially tells you what the results mean and what the authors believe they mean. And they give their own theoretical approaches to it, or their own, based on experience, what they think with cited resources. Then you move on to the conclusion of the paper. In the conclusion, I'm just going to read here. Our study is the first to identify the species and likely elements from which Paleoindians produced eyed bone needles. Bone needle production techniques have until this point largely been theoretical, based on incised bone objects, argued to represent bone needle preforms in experimental needle production. We were able to clarify some aspects of bone needle production techniques through the combined use of zooms and micro-CT scanning, the first applications of both of these technologies to study the Paleoindian bone needles, but not beads. It's already been done on beads. Our results are strong evidence for tailored garment production using bone needles and fur-bearing pelts. Such garments might have looked comparable to those of the Inuit, who sewed fur-bearing pelts into the fringes of parkas, whose base material was typically comprised of ungulate hide, and used them for hats and mittens. The cold conditions of the North American Younger Dryas in northerly latitudes likely inspired the greater reliance on such garments, and the sparse early Paleoindian archaeological record suggests a relative abundance of bone needles and fur bearers in Younger Dryas age sites relative to periods before and after. Finally, our results have some relevance to the debate surrounding early Paleoindian subsistence. The presence of fur bearers in early Paleoindian sites has been argued to support the existence of a broad spectrum subsistence base characterized by generalist rather than specialist diets. Our results are a good reminder that foragers use animal products for a wide range of purposes other than subsistence, and the mere presence of animal bones in an archaeological site need not be indicative of diet. And this is something that, as someone who likes human behavioral ecology, the baseline of archaeological sites, I can look at it and be like, here's the food that they were eating. Based on the bones and the stones here, they were clearly hunting and butchering these animals for food and subsistence. That's the baseline. We know that. Well, obviously, they were using the bison and the mammoth for that too. But finding these extra bones and stuff here too, like the paper was saying earlier, foxes and hares don't really give you the caloric return that a mammoth does, right? So it's not really worth investing, hunting, and chasing them around. But passively trapping them outside of camp while you're processing the mammoth does give you the ability to spend your calories doing the mammoth processing while you can also be trapping that on the side. And something Donny always taught me too is when you're in a survival situation, make a fish trap. Put that fish trap in the water, That way, when you go hunting and you don't catch a deer, you can come back. You may still have fish. It's passive calories that you're not wasting doing something else. But like this paper is saying, it's actually interesting because this is a big Clovis site that is one of the most well excavated and well documented. And what it's showing us is they weren't just eating mammoth and bison. They were eating other things. Now, we knew that, but it wasn't that they were eating them. They probably did. I mean, fox meat probably tastes pretty good when you're starving and in the Ice Age, but they were using them for their fur, their bones, and their utility, which is quite interesting. So that's the conclusion. So yeah, it's not a Roman mosaic, it's not a Clovis point, and it's not, you know, a giant mammoth skeleton, but a bone needle is interesting. It is something that people needed to survive in the daily life, as Spencer said. And I said earlier, it is so cold in Wyoming, once it gets below 0, you can die. Like if you go outside too long, you'll die. Even when it's like at 32, because it's just so cold, like below freezing there. So these people had to do that, and constantly, they were probably constantly sewing their furs, constantly re-sewing stuff, especially if it ripped or it tore, constantly doing that. So a bone needle was a huge aspect of their toolkit that allowed them to survive. Because yeah, hunting a mammoth and butchering it and eating all its meat, smoking all that meat, tanning the hides, doing some kind of ceremony with it, sure, that's what Clovis people probably did. But they also spent a shit ton of time flint knapping, making stone tools, and sewing. And this paper is interesting because it shows us that not only is a bone needle so integral to life in the past, as Camille pointed out, but also using science on something so insignificant to some people, but to, you know, people like Camille, Spencer, and McKenna, that is pretty interesting. Using science to understand it, you can also learn more about this. Is, oh, they weren't just hunting the bison and the mammoth. They were trapping other things too and made the bone needles out of that, and here's why. So I guess that's that. I hope you found that as interesting as I did. I mean, this paper just came out, so I figured to do an episode on it, and I'm glad I got Camille to make that video to put it in there. I might do more of that if you guys have comments and stuff. Please, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. If you haven't shared this video with people that you think might find it interesting, please do that too. You can go to davidianhow.com/store to get any of my t-shirts, hoodies, merch, shorts, stickers, things like that, or the art prints that Tori makes. And yeah, please subscribe, and I will see you again next week. I asked both of them what the name of the paper was, and this was very funny. And then what was the title of the paper?
When we get it right.
What was the title of the paper? You know? Spencer had to look it up.
Don't ask me that. Something about like needles made out of canids, felids, and hair.
Cool. We'll
Yeah.
put it up here.
Okay.
The title of the paper is like Early Paleoindian Use of Canids, Felids, and Hares for Bone Needle Production at the LaPrele Site, Wyoming, USA.